Hello, I want to talk today about unconscious biases. This is a second attempt. I uploaded a video, and when I started to rewatch it, I realised that actually I was confusing terms and I wasn't explaining definitions very clearly and so on and so forth. So I'm going to try and do a better job of it now. So, unconscious bias is when you will have a biased attitude that you are not consciously aware of. All right, this can be about all manner of things. It can be about the quality of a product. You might have an unconscious bias toward a branded product that's been heavily marketed in your country of where you reside. You could have an unconscious bias against certain ethnic groups because they've been depicted in media, in culture, in news, or in fiction like Hollywood films and TV and books as in stereotypical ways. So unconsciously you can form attitudes without realizing that's what unconscious means. You don't realize you're doing it, but your brain has created a sort of rule, a sort of algorithm, if you like, to file that information away based on. It's almost like a search engine in a way, your brain, So when someone says a word, the most it's literally like a search engine, actually, the more I think about it, the way cognition works and the brain and memory work, because someone says a word and the first thing that pops into your brain, into your mind, will be, if your brain was a search engine, will be the subject that returned the most entries. Does that make sense? The most hits? Because repetition creates kind of mental attitudes and constructs and biases and things like that. Sometimes consciously, but sometimes unconsciously. All right. So a way of demonstrating how this can happen in real time, with recent events, is I want to talk about the awful, heartbreaking murder of Sarah Everard. It's not current, but it's reasonably recent that's been in the news. Recency. The recency effect will also influence the mental associations and biases that we form as well. All right, so we might, up until the Sarah Everard case was all over the media, we might have, if we heard or saw something about a woman being murdered walking home, we would probably, our first thought would probably be, oh, that was a stalker, that was a man who either, was known, well, it's usually someone who's known by the person, who, wanted, would probably, would presume, they probably wanted something sexual from this woman. So we would probably presume that it was a civilian, all right? But the recency effect would take over when the Sarah Everard case was at the forefront of everyone's conscious mind, and she was murdered by a police officer. That woman walking home murdered during the week when that was peak news, our first thought would be police officer. Does that make sense? So recency effects also sometimes create and affect the unconscious biases. And you can see this in terms of, in the news media, there's often a lot of kind of propaganda about people feigning disability and not really needing disability benefits and things like that. And when there's a lot of articles about that, hate crimes toward, visibly identifiable disabled people will skyrocket, which is really, really sad. And it's because people form a mental association, an unconscious bias, and they then act those out. So it's not nice. It can have really horrible effects. However, sometimes a really good-hearted person can just create an unconscious bias. And an easy example for a British person, a Western person, to give is, if I ask you, if I say, oh, I don't want to use specific words that might get flagged by YouTube and stuff like that. Do you know what I mean? And might be blocked for certain reasons, or but well, I'm only going to use this word once, okay? So if I say the word terrorist to you, right? What's the first thing that comes into your mind? Is it an Aryan-looking, blonde-haired, blue-eyed European person? Probably not. All right. But again, recent events can affect whatever's going on politically and whatever is going into our awareness around us can influence those unconscious biases. Because whatever popped into your head just now when I used that word, right, a different image would pop into your head during the time when the IRA were, when there were a lot of bomb attacks and things like that, because that was current, so you would associate. So it's a handy example, actually, because it gives you an example of where it's not racism, it's an unconscious bias based on the information that's gone in recently and the mental shortcut that your brain has created. Because in the 80s or 90s, if the T word was mentioned, you would think a Northern Irish person, and it doesn't mean that you're bigoted and racist against Northern Irish people, but probably during that point in time you would feel slightly more nervous getting on an aeroplane with someone like from Northern Ireland than you would anywhere else. Whereas shortly after 9/11, that created the effect of feeling a little bit nervous, unconsciously or consciously getting on a plane with someone from a different demographic. Yeah. So are you a racist for doing that? No, you have a brain that is just doing its thing with algorithms and recent hits like a search engine, recent information, recent associations, and it's an unconscious bias that you have formed. All right. So why am I talking about all of this? I just feel that cancel culture has got a little bit out of hand and has gone off the tracks. Yeah. So if you innocently show evidence of having an unconscious bias, right, it's not ideal, of course it's not, and it's great if someone can bring it to your awareness so you can correct it. But it's like, oh my gosh, like we're not fully in control of all this stuff, particularly if it's unconscious. And if you come out with something that isn't the most ultimately politically correct sort of sentiment, you just get attacked viciously these days. All right. So I would just please appeal to people to try and pay attention to the difference between someone who's legitimately a hateful, mean-hearted, division-causing, violent or unpleasant or problematic personality, and someone who's just an unconscious bias has just slipped out. All right. In no way whatsoever do I want this video to come off as being apologist in nature, as making excuses for people who behave in unacceptable ways, all right? But I feel that a lot of people are starting to realise that the level of hypervigilance of calling people out and presuming that someone means something in a mean-hearted way has gotten a bit silly, and good-hearted, genuine, kind, loving people are being cancelled sort of on the turn of a sixpence, and it's unrealistic. Oh, sorry. It's unrealistic to expect anyone to communicate in the most perfectly politically correct, pure, perfect way 100% of the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Please stop expecting that of people. It's gotten out of hand, and we're not allowed to be human and fallible anymore. And all I would like you to think about, if you have participated in calling people out and hounding them and aggressing toward them or cancelling them or demonising someone, please just spend a bit of time thinking about how this is just a feature of the way the brain works sometimes, and that it would be helpful if you just took a little bit of time or a little bit of energy into exploring whether that's all that just happened. All right, because expressions of intentional hate and bad-hearted stuff do need to be stamped out, but oh my goodness, sometimes the brain just makes an association quite innocently, and it comes out of a really good-hearted person, and it's a mistake, an honest mistake. We have to allow people to be fallible. All right, I hope that this was taken how it was intended. I'm sure someone will misinterpret it, because people can be very determined when it comes to that kind of thing. However, hopefully this spoke to someone and gave them food for thought. All right, if you've made it this far, thank you for listening and take good care.